In New York, people didn't just respect Nathaniel Russo, they feared him. Officially, he owned $1 billion luxury hotel empire. Unofficially, many still whispered the same title behind closed doors, the Mafia Boss. But weeks before his wedding, the most powerful man in the city became obsessed with a single question. Did his fiancée love him, or only the fortune attached to his name? So Nathaniel made the world believe he was bankrupt. Within days, friends disappeared, allies vanished, and the woman he planned to marry started looking for a way out. Only one person stayed: Grace Holloway, a plus-size maid most people ignored, and she was about to uncover a secret that could destroy a mafia empire from the inside. For more than 20 years, Nathaniel Russo had built a reputation that few men dared challenge. In public, he was known as a billionaire hotel magnate. On paper, everything he owned was perfectly legal: luxury hotels, resorts, investment firms, real estate. But New York had always been a city of whispers, and the whispers surrounding the Russo family had never disappeared. People called Nathaniel many things: business genius, kingmaker, power broker. But behind closed doors, one title survived longer than all the others: the Mafia Boss. Whether the rumors were true no longer mattered. The reputation alone was enough. Politicians returned his calls. Competitors avoided direct conflict, and anyone foolish enough to betray him usually regretted it. Yet despite all that power, Nathaniel couldn't control one thing: doubt. It began 6 months before his wedding. At first, it was small, a feeling, a question, a quiet voice in the back of his mind. Every time Vanessa talked about private jets, every time she asked about company assets, every time she showed more excitement over luxury purchases than their future together, the voice grew louder. Did she love him? Or did she love the empire attached to his name? The question haunted him, because unlike his business rivals, Vanessa knew him personally. She knew his routines, his habits, his weaknesses. Most importantly, she knew exactly how much he was worth. One evening, Nathaniel sat alone in his private office overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly below. Normally the view relaxed him. Not tonight. Across the desk sat two people he trusted more than anyone: his attorney and his longtime financial advisor. Neither spoke. Both understood this meeting was unusual. Finally, Nathaniel broke the silence. "I want to disappear." The attorney frowned. "Disappear?" Nathaniel nodded. "I want everyone to believe I'm finished." The room went quiet. Even for men who had worked beside him for years, the idea sounded insane. Nathaniel leaned back. If my money vanished tomorrow, who would stay? Neither man had an answer, because Nathaniel wasn't asking them. He was asking himself. Over the next several weeks, a carefully planned operation began. Anonymous reports appeared online. Industry analysts suddenly questioned the future of the Russo empire. Financial journalists began discussing major losses. Then came the biggest rumor of all: bankruptcy. Within days, the story spread across New York. People were stunned. Some were skeptical. Many were delighted. Powerful men often attract hidden enemies. Nathaniel had plenty. From his office, he watched the reaction unfold, and it was worse than he expected. Several business partners disappeared immediately. Investors stopped calling. Friends became difficult to reach. People who once begged for invitations suddenly found excuses to stay away. It was almost impressive. Years of loyalty evaporated in less than a month. But nobody changed faster than Vanessa. The difference appeared gradually. Then all at once, wedding plans stopped. Phone calls became private. Conversations became shorter. The warmth disappeared from her voice. One afternoon, Nathaniel walked into the dining room unexpectedly. Vanessa quickly closed her laptop. Too quickly. The movement caught his attention. "Everything okay?" he asked. She smiled, but the smile looked forced. "Of course," Nathaniel nodded, yet something felt wrong. Very wrong. At the same time, another person had started noticing the changes. Someone nobody paid attention to. Grace Holloway. The plus-size maid had worked at the estate for nearly 3 years. Most wealthy guests barely remembered her name. Some didn't acknowledge her at all. Grace was used to it. She had spent most of her life being overlooked. People often judged her before speaking to her. They saw her curvy figure, her maid uniform, her quiet personality, then immediately decided she wasn't important. Grace had learned to live with it. In some ways, being invisible had advantages. People revealed their true selves when they thought nobody important was watching. And lately, Grace had been seeing a side of Vanessa that made her uncomfortable. The future bride was becoming impatient, rude, secretive. One morning, Grace accidentally overheard Vanessa speaking on the phone. She wasn't trying to listen, but one sentence stopped her cold. "I need options if everything collapses." Grace frowned. Options? For a wedding? Or something else? Before she could hear more, Vanessa noticed her nearby and ended the call immediately. The interaction lasted only seconds. Yet something about it felt wrong. Very wrong. Grace couldn't explain why. Not yet. But for the first time, she began wondering if the woman preparing to marry New York's most feared mafia boss was hiding something. And before long, she would discover the truth was far worse than anyone imagined. The fake bankruptcy had only been public for 3 weeks. But for Nathaniel Russo, it felt like an entire year. Every day revealed another, uncomfortable truth. The powerful mafia boss who once controlled rooms with a single glance was suddenly becoming invisible. People still recognized him. They just no longer wanted anything to do with him. One afternoon, Nathaniel arrived at an exclusive private club in Manhattan. For years, the staff had treated him like royalty. A table was always available. A manager always greeted him personally. A dozen familiar faces usually rushed over to shake his hand. This time was different. The hostess smiled politely, then informed him there would be a wait. Nathaniel almost laughed. A wait. For the first time in nearly 15 years, he wasn't angry. He was fascinated. The experiment was working, and the results were ugly. Meanwhile, Vanessa seemed increasingly distracted. The woman who once wanted to discuss wedding details every evening barely mentioned the wedding at all. Instead, she became obsessed with one subject: money. Not how Nathaniel was feeling, not whether he was sleeping, not whether he needed support. Money. Every conversation eventually found its way back there. What happens if the company sells? How protected are your personal assets? What about your overseas accounts? The questions never stopped. Nathaniel answered carefully, sometimes honestly, sometimes strategically. Each answer seemed to make Vanessa more nervous. One evening, they attended a charity dinner together. At least, they arrived together. For most of the night, Vanessa barely spoke to him. Instead, she spent her time networking, laughing, flirting, positioning herself near wealthy investors. Nathaniel noticed everything. He always did. Years of navigating both boardrooms and dangerous power struggles had sharpened his instincts. People rarely fooled him for long. When the event ended, Vanessa climbed into the car without saying a word. The silence lasted several minutes. Finally, Nathaniel asked a question. "Are you happy?" Vanessa looked surprised. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one." She looked away toward the window. "I don't know." The answer hurt more than he expected, not because she was uncertain, because she didn't seem concerned about being uncertain. The conversation ended there. But something inside Nathaniel finally shifted. For months, he had been searching for reasons to defend her behavior. Now those reasons were disappearing. Back at the estate, Grace noticed the tension immediately. Unlike Vanessa, Grace paid attention to people. She always had. Perhaps because so few people paid attention to her. The plus-size maid spent most of her days moving quietly through the estate, cleaning rooms, organizing supplies, helping employees, listening. People often assumed she wasn't intelligent because of her appearance. Grace had learned not to take it personally. Their assumptions gave her access to the truth. And lately, the truth seemed increasingly troubling. One morning, She entered a conference room after a private meeting had ended. Several glasses remained on the table. A few documents had been forgotten. As she cleaned, she noticed a note partially hidden beneath a folder. Only one sentence was visible. Once Russo loses control, the acquisition can proceed. Grace froze. Russo. There was only one Russo being discussed in this house. Nathaniel. She wasn't trying to invade anyone's privacy. But the sentence bothered her. Why would someone be planning for Nathaniel to lose control? And who would benefit from it? The questions followed her all day. That evening, she saw Vanessa leaving the estate. Again, nothing unusual about that, except this time Vanessa wasn't alone. A black luxury sedan waited outside the gates. A man stepped out. Grace didn't recognize him, but she immediately noticed something strange. Vanessa looked nervous, not excited, not happy, nervous. The two exchanged a folder, spoke briefly, then went their separate ways. The entire interaction lasted less than a minute, yet Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something important, something she wasn't supposed to see. A few days later, things became even stranger. Nathaniel was reviewing financial reports inside his office when Grace delivered coffee. As she placed the cup on his desk, she noticed something unusual. The powerful Mafia Boss looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. The sight surprised her. Most people saw Nathaniel Russo as untouchable, a man feared throughout New York, a man whose name carried enormous influence. But sitting there alone, staring at reports nobody else wanted to discuss, he looked surprisingly human. For a brief moment, Grace felt sorry for him. Not because he was rich, not because he was powerful, because everyone seemed to be abandoning him. And somehow, he still didn't fully realize how bad things had become. Unfortunately, Grace was beginning to understand. The people closest to Nathaniel weren't simply leaving. Someone might be helping push him toward the edge. And if her suspicions were correct, the danger wasn't coming from his enemies. It was coming from inside his own home. As the weeks passed, Nathaniel Russo began noticing a pattern. The people with the most influence disappeared first. The people who once called him a friend suddenly became impossible to reach. Even some long-time employees started quietly searching for other opportunities. Fear was spreading. The rumor of bankruptcy had infected everything. And despite being one of the most feared men in New York, Nathaniel couldn't stop it. That realization bothered him more than he expected. For years, people had treated him like a king. Now he was discovering how much of that respect had been rented, not earned. One morning, Nathaniel arrived at the estate's main kitchen before sunrise. He couldn't sleep. Lately, sleep had become difficult. The room was nearly empty except for one person. Grace, the plus-size maid, stood at a counter organizing supplies for the day. Unlike many of the younger employees, Grace always arrived early. And unlike most people in Nathaniel's life, she never seemed intimidated by him. Not because she was fearless, because she treated everyone the same. Whether someone was a billionaire or a janitor, Nathaniel noticed something else too. Grace always worked harder than everyone around her. She never complained, never sought attention, never tried to impress anyone. In fact, most guests barely acknowledged her existence. Nathaniel had seen it happen countless times. People walked past her without making eye contact. They spoke around her instead of to her. Some even made jokes about her weight when they thought she couldn't hear. Grace always pretended not to notice, but Nathaniel noticed. One afternoon during a private event, he watched a wealthy guest mistake Grace for catering staff and rudely snap his fingers at her. The man didn't even know her name. Grace simply smiled politely and helped him anyway. Later, Nathaniel found himself wondering something. How does someone stay kind after being treated like that for years? The question lingered, because kindness was becoming increasingly rare in his world, especially now. Meanwhile, Vanessa's behavior continued growing more suspicious. She spent less time at the estate, more time taking private meetings, more time making secret phone calls. Every day seemed to create another wall between her and Nathaniel. Yet Grace remained exactly the same. One rainy evening, Nathaniel returned from a disappointing meeting with investors. The weather matched his mood. As he entered the estate, he found Grace helping one of the older employees carry supplies. The woman looked exhausted. Grace looked exhausted too, yet she was smiling, helping, encouraging. Nathaniel stood there watching for a moment. Nobody knew he was there. Nobody was performing for his benefit. That was what made it meaningful. Grace wasn't kind because powerful people were watching. She was kind because that was who she was. Later that night, Nathaniel found a small tray outside his office. A cup of coffee, a sandwich, and a handwritten note. "You skipped lunch again. Please eat. Grace." Nathaniel stared at the note, then laughed quietly to himself. For weeks, billionaires, attorneys, executives, and investors had spoken to him about money. The only person worried about whether he had eaten lunch was the maid. Something about that realization hit him harder than expected. The next day, he stopped Grace in the hallway. "You left the note?" Grace immediately looked embarrassed. "I hope that wasn't inappropriate." Nathaniel shook his head. "No." For a moment, he looked at her, really looked at her. Not as an employee, not as a maid, as a person. Grace wasn't glamorous like Vanessa. She didn't wear designer dresses. She didn't attract attention when she entered a room. Her curvy figure had made her the target of judgment her entire life. Yet Nathaniel had never met anyone more genuine. "Thank you," he said. Grace smiled. A real smile. Not the fake smiles Nathaniel encountered every day. "You're welcome." The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet, somehow it felt more honest than most of the conversations he'd had all month. What neither of them realized was that their growing trust was about to become very important, because the secrets surrounding Vanessa were becoming harder to hide, and Grace was closer to the truth than anyone realized. 3 days later, while cleaning one of the private offices, she would discover something that transformed suspicion into certainty. Something that proved Nathaniel wasn't simply being abandoned, he was being betrayed, and the betrayal had been happening right under his roof. 3 days later, Grace discovered the first piece of evidence, and once she saw it, she could never unsee it. The morning started like any other. The estate was busy. Staff moved between offices. Guests arrived and left. Meetings came and went. For everyone else, it was an ordinary day. For Grace, it became the day everything changed. She was cleaning one of the private conference rooms located near the executive wing. Normally, very few people used the room, but lately, Vanessa had been spending more time there, usually alone, sometimes with visitors nobody recognized. Grace didn't think much of it, until she noticed a folder partially hidden beneath the conference table. At first, she intended to leave it alone. Then she saw a familiar name, Russo Holdings. Her stomach tightened. Grace looked toward the hallway. Nobody was there. She glanced back at the folder. The top page had slipped out slightly, just enough to reveal a few lines. What she saw immediately felt wrong. Very wrong. The document listed confidential company information, financial projections, investment plans, property acquisitions, information that should never have been available outside Nathaniel's inner circle. Then Grace noticed something even more alarming. Several sections had been marked with handwritten notes. Beside one property acquisition was a short message: delay approval, increase investor concerns, push media coverage. Grace frowned. Why would anyone want to damage the company intentionally? The question became even more disturbing when she turned the page. At the bottom was the logo of a competing hospitality corporation, one of Nathaniel's largest rivals. Grace's heart began racing. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't wedding drama. Someone was actively helping Nathaniel's competitors, and someone inside the estate was providing information. Footsteps suddenly echoed from the hallway. Grace quickly returned everything, exactly as she found it. Seconds later, the conference room door opened. Vanessa stepped inside. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Something felt different, as though Vanessa sensed something, not proof, not certainty, just instinct. "Finished cleaning?" Vanessa asked. "Almost." Vanessa stared at her for another second, then nodded. Grace left immediately, but the feeling stayed with her. The feeling that she had accidentally stepped into something dangerous. Over the next several days, the evidence continued appearing. Small pieces, tiny clues, each one insignificant by itself. Together, impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Grace delivered refreshments to another private meeting. The guests barely acknowledged her. That wasn't unusual. Most wealthy people never did. One executive even continued speaking while she stood less than 3 feet away, completely dismissing her presence. Grace had experienced that her entire life. People saw a plus-size maid. They assumed she wasn't paying attention. What they never realized was that invisible people hear everything. As she collected empty glasses, she heard one sentence. Just one. But it changed everything. Vanessa says Russo still doesn't suspect anything. Grace nearly dropped the tray. She kept walking, kept smiling, kept pretending she heard nothing. Inside, her heart pounded. Russo still doesn't suspect anything. The words echoed in her head for the rest of the day. By evening, Grace could no longer deny the truth. Vanessa wasn't preparing to leave Nathaniel. She was helping destroy him. The realization frightened her, because Nathaniel Russo wasn't just a billionaire. He was one of the most powerful men in New York. A man feared by politicians. A man respected by rivals. A man whose enemies rarely acted openly. Yet somehow, the biggest threat to his empire wasn't coming from outside. It was sleeping beside him. That night, Grace sat alone in her small apartment above the staff quarters, unable to sleep. She kept asking herself the same question. What should she do? If she stayed silent, Nathaniel could lose everything. If she spoke up, nobody might believe her. After all, who would trust the word of a maid over the future wife of a mafia boss? The answer seemed obvious. Nobody. And yet, Grace couldn't stop thinking about the lonely man she had seen sitting in his office. The man everyone else had abandoned. The man who thanked her for a simple cup of coffee. The man who still had no idea what was happening behind his back. For the first time, Grace realized this wasn't just about loyalty. It was about doing what was right, even if it cost her everything. What she didn't know was that the danger had already begun, because Vanessa was starting to notice something. The maid she had ignored for years was paying attention, and that made Grace far more dangerous than anyone realized. 3 days later, Grace discovered the first piece of evidence, and once she saw it, she could never unsee it. The morning started like any other. The estate was busy. Staff moved between offices. Guests arrived and left. Meetings came and went. For everyone else, it was an ordinary day. For Grace, it became the day everything changed. She was cleaning one of the private conference rooms located near the executive wing. Normally, very few people used the room. But lately, Vanessa had been spending more time there, usually alone. Sometimes with visitors nobody recognized. Grace didn't think much of it, until she noticed a folder partially hidden beneath the conference table. At first, she intended to leave it alone. Then she saw a familiar name, Russo Holdings. Her stomach tightened. Grace looked toward the hallway. Nobody was there. She glanced back at the folder. The top page had slipped out slightly, just enough to reveal a few lines. What she saw immediately felt wrong, very wrong. The document listed confidential company information, financial projections, investment plans, property acquisitions, information that should never have been available outside Nathaniel's inner circle. Then Grace noticed something even more alarming. Several sections had been marked with handwritten notes. Beside one property acquisition was a short message: delay approval, increase investor concerns, push media coverage. Grace frowned. Why would anyone want to damage the company intentionally? The question became even more disturbing when she turned the page. At the bottom was the logo of a competing hospitality corporation, one of Nathaniel's largest rivals. Grace's heart began racing. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't wedding drama. Someone was actively helping Nathaniel's competitors. and someone inside the estate was providing information. Footsteps suddenly echoed from the hallway. Grace quickly returned everything exactly as she found it. Seconds later, the conference room door opened. Vanessa stepped inside. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Something felt different, as though Vanessa sensed something. Not proof, not certainty, just instinct. "Finished cleaning?" Vanessa asked. "Almost." Vanessa stared at her for another second, then nodded. Grace left immediately, but the feeling stayed with her, the feeling that she had accidentally stepped into something dangerous. Over the next several days, the evidence continued appearing. Small pieces, tiny clues, each one insignificant by itself. Together, impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Grace delivered refreshments to another private meeting. The guests barely acknowledged her. That wasn't unusual. Most wealthy people never did. One executive even continued speaking while she stood less than 3 feet away, completely dismissing her presence. Grace had experienced that her entire life. People saw a plus-size maid. They assumed she wasn't paying attention. What they never realized was that invisible people hear everything. As she collected empty glasses, she heard one sentence. Just one. But it changed everything. "Vanessa says Russo still doesn't suspect anything." Grace nearly dropped the tray. She kept walking, kept smiling, kept pretending she heard nothing. Inside, her heart pounded. Russo still doesn't suspect anything. The words echoed in her head for the rest of the day. By evening, Grace could no longer deny the truth. Vanessa wasn't preparing to leave Nathaniel. She was helping destroy him. The realization frightened her, because Nathaniel Russo wasn't just a billionaire. He was one of the most powerful men in New York. A man feared by politicians. A man respected by rivals. A man whose enemies rarely acted openly. Yet somehow, the biggest threat to his empire wasn't coming from outside. It was sleeping beside him. That night, Grace sat alone in her small apartment above the staff quarters. Unable to sleep, she kept asking herself the same question. What should she do? If she stayed silent, Nathaniel could lose everything. If she spoke up, nobody might believe her. After all, who would trust the word of a maid over the future wife of a mafia boss? The answer seemed obvious. Nobody. And yet, Grace couldn't stop thinking about the lonely man she had seen sitting in his office. The man everyone else had abandoned. The man who thanked her for a simple cup of coffee. The man who still had no idea what was happening behind his back. For the first time, Grace realized this wasn't just about loyalty. It was about doing what was right, even if it cost her everything. What she didn't know was that the danger had already begun, because Vanessa was starting to notice something. The maid she had ignored for years was paying attention, and that made Grace far more dangerous than anyone realized. For nearly a week, Grace carried the secret alone. Every day became more difficult. Every conversation she overheard, every suspicious meeting, every nervous glance from Vanessa, all of it pushed her toward the same conclusion. Nathaniel Russo was being betrayed, and the betrayal was much larger than a broken engagement. The problem was simple. Grace had pieces of the puzzle, but not enough to prove the entire picture. That uncertainty terrified her. One wrong accusation could destroy her life. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't an executive. She wasn't a powerful member of New York's elite. She was a plus-size maid most people barely noticed. Who would believe her? The question followed her everywhere, until one evening, she finally made a decision. She couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. Nathaniel was alone in his private library when Grace knocked on the door. The room was quiet. The large windows overlooked Manhattan. Rain tapped softly against the glass. "Come in." Grace stepped inside. Immediately, she felt nervous. Nathaniel looked up from a stack of reports. The exhaustion on his face was impossible to miss. For a moment, Grace almost changed her mind. Then she remembered the documents, the meetings. the lies, and she forced herself to continue. "I need to tell you something." Nathaniel immediately sensed her seriousness. He closed the file in front of him. "You have my attention." Grace took a deep breath. Then she told him everything. Not theories, not assumptions, only facts. The folder, the conversations, the note mentioning Russo, the meeting with competitors, the statement she overheard. Russo still doesn't suspect anything. When she finished, silence filled the room. Nathaniel didn't interrupt, didn't react, didn't speak. He simply sat there thinking. Finally, he asked a question. "Why are you telling me this?" Grace blinked. The question surprised her. "I thought that was obvious." "It isn't." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly. "Most people protect themselves." Grace looked down, then answered honestly. "Maybe." She hesitated. "But someone should protect you too." The words hung in the air. Simple, sincere, without manipulation, without expectation. Nathaniel stared at her. For months, people had spoken to him about money, power, assets, damage control. Nobody had spoken to him like that. Not even Vanessa. Especially not Vanessa. Something shifted inside him. A small crack in the wall he had built around himself. For the first time in a long time, he felt trust. Real trust. "Thank you," he said quietly. Grace looked surprised. "I haven't actually helped yet." Nathaniel almost smiled. "You already have." The next morning, Nathaniel activated resources that few people even knew existed. If the public saw him as a hotel billionaire, that was fine. But the Russo family had survived for generations because they understood information. His private investigators began working immediately. Former intelligence specialists, cybersecurity experts, financial analysts, people whose loyalty could not be bought by competitors. Within days, the investigation started producing results. Then the results became evidence. The evidence became proof, and the proof was devastating. Unauthorized access records, leaked internal documents, encrypted communications, financial transfers connected to shell companies. Each discovery pointed in the same direction. Vanessa. The realization hurt more than Nathaniel expected. Not because he loved her. That feeling had already begun fading, because she had looked him in the eye every day while helping destroy him. One evening, after reviewing another report, Nathaniel found himself sitting alone in the kitchen, thinking, processing, questioning everything. A few minutes later, Grace entered. She stopped immediately. "Sorry, I didn't know anyone was here." Nathaniel gestured toward an empty chair. "Stay." Grace hesitated, then sat down. For the next hour, they talked. Not about the investigation. Not about Vanessa. About life, family, failure, regret, dreams. Nathaniel learned that Grace had spent years caring for her sick mother, that she often skipped opportunities because family responsibilities came first, that people had underestimated her since childhood, not because she lacked intelligence, because they judged her appearance before they learned who she was. Grace learned something too, behind the reputation, behind the headlines, behind the title of Mafia Boss. Nathaniel was lonely, far lonelier than anyone realized. Power attracted attention, but not necessarily connection. By the time the conversation ended, both of them felt something changing. Not romance, not yet. Something more important. Trust. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the estate, Vanessa was beginning to panic. The investigation had become harder to control. Questions were being asked. Documents were disappearing. People were becoming nervous. For the first time, she realized someone might have discovered the truth. Then she noticed something that made her even more uncomfortable. Nathaniel was spending time with Grace, listening to Grace, trusting Grace. The maid she had ignored for years was becoming a problem. And Vanessa had never been the kind of person who tolerated problems for very long. Soon, she would make a move, a dangerous one, a move designed to destroy Grace's credibility before the truth could destroy her. The Russo Foundation Gala was supposed to be a celebration. At least, that was how it appeared on the surface. The ballroom was filled with politicians, investors, celebrities, and executives from across New York. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead. Champagne flowed freely. Elegant music echoed throughout the room. Yet beneath the luxury, tension lingered. Everyone wanted to see Nathaniel Russo. Everyone wanted to know whether the rumors were true. Was the Mafia Boss really losing everything? Or was there more to the story? Nathaniel noticed the stares the moment he arrived. The whispers followed him everywhere. Months ago, those same people would have rushed to greet him. Now they observed from a distance, waiting, watching, judging. Nathaniel wasn't surprised. What surprised him was how little he cared, because by now, he knew exactly who those people were, and more importantly, who they weren't. Across the ballroom stood Vanessa, beautiful, elegant, perfectly composed. To anyone watching, she looked like the devoted fiancée of a struggling billionaire. Only Nathaniel knew the truth. Only Nathaniel knew how carefully she had hidden her betrayal, and tonight, that betrayal was about to be exposed. Meanwhile, Grace remained where she always felt safest, near the edges of the room, helping staff, avoiding attention. The plus-size Maid had never enjoyed being the center of attention. Years of being judged for her appearance had taught her to stay invisible. Invisible felt safe. Invisible meant people left her alone. Unfortunately, tonight would be different, because Vanessa had already made her decision. If she was going down, Grace was coming with her. The attack started suddenly. One moment guests were enjoying dinner. The next, raised voices echoed through the ballroom. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. People moved toward the disturbance. Grace looked up in confusion. Vanessa was standing nearby, looking directly at her. The expression on her face sent a chill through Grace's body. Then Vanessa spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "There she is." The room immediately grew quiet. Grace felt hundreds of eyes turn toward her. Her stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Grace asked. Vanessa shook her head dramatically. "I wanted to believe you were innocent." The words hit like a slap. A murmur spread through the crowd. Grace felt panic rising. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa stepped forward. "The leaked information." The ballroom became silent. "The stolen documents." More whispers. Then came the accusation. It was her. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Grace stood frozen, humiliated, shocked. She couldn't believe what was happening. Then the comments began. Quiet at first. Then louder. "A maid? That actually makes sense. How else would information leave the estate?" Grace felt her face burn. Years of judgment came rushing back. Every insult, every cruel joke, every person who had looked at her and decided she wasn't good enough. Not because of anything she had done, because of who they thought she was. Vanessa saw the doubt spreading and smiled. She believed she had won. Then a voice cut through the room. No. The single word silenced everyone. "Nathaniel Russo." The crowd immediately parted. The atmosphere changed. Even now, despite the bankruptcy rumors, people still feared him. Nathaniel walked forward slowly, his expression unreadable. His eyes never leaving Vanessa. "No," he repeated. "Grace didn't do this." Vanessa laughed nervously. "Nathaniel, you're emotional." "No." His voice remained calm, dangerously calm, the kind of calm that had made powerful men nervous for decades. For the first time all evening, Vanessa looked uncertain. Nathaniel stepped beside Grace. Then something unexpected happened. He placed himself between her and the crowd, between her and the accusations, between her and the humiliation. Grace looked up at him, stunned. Nobody had ever protected her like that before. Nobody. Nathaniel turned toward the guests. "You want to know something interesting?" Silence. Over the past few months, Almost everyone in this room abandoned me. No one answered, because they knew it was true. When people thought I was bankrupt, they disappeared. His gaze swept across the ballroom. Friends disappeared. Partners disappeared. Allies disappeared. Then he looked toward Grace. But she didn't. The room remained silent. Nathaniel continued, "The woman standing beside me has shown more loyalty than people with 10 times her status." Grace felt tears forming in her eyes. Nathaniel wasn't finished. "You judged her because she's a maid." The words landed hard. "You overlooked her because of her appearance." More silence. "You assumed she wasn't important." Now people looked uncomfortable because every word was true. Then Nathaniel delivered the sentence that changed everything. "Grace Holloway is the reason I discovered the truth." Vanessa's face lost all color, completely, because she finally understood. Nathaniel knew, not part of the truth, all of it. The game was over. And standing before one of the most powerful men in New York, Vanessa suddenly realized she had nowhere left to run. The evidence was ready. The attorneys were waiting. And in just a few moments, the entire city would learn exactly who had betrayed the Mafia Boss. The ballroom remained completely silent. Hundreds of people stood frozen. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. For months, New York had been obsessed with one question. Was Nathaniel Russo really losing everything? Now they were about to learn the truth. Nathaniel slowly turned toward the stage. A simple nod was all it took. Immediately, his legal team stepped forward. Several large screens illuminated behind them. Documents appeared, financial records, communication logs, private transfers. The atmosphere changed instantly. Vanessa's confidence began disappearing with every new piece of evidence. The first document showed confidential company information, leaving Russo Holdings. The second showed encrypted communications between Vanessa and executives working for one of Nathaniel's largest competitors. The third revealed payments routed through multiple shell companies. Each document told the same story: betrayal, deliberate, calculated, and ongoing. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. People who had spent months admiring Vanessa now stared at her in disbelief. The elegant future wife of New York's most powerful mafia boss had been secretly helping destroy him. Vanessa tried to interrupt, tried to explain, tried to deny everything, but every excuse collapsed beneath the evidence. Finally, her voice broke. "You lied first." The room fell silent again. Nathaniel looked directly at her. Vanessa pointed toward him. "Tell them." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Nathaniel nodded. "She's right." Confused whispers spread immediately. The bankruptcy wasn't real. More whispers. Nathaniel waited, then continued. "I created the illusion because I wanted the truth." The room listened carefully. "I wanted to know who would stay when money disappeared." His gaze moved slowly across the crowd. "I wanted to know who actually cared about me." Many people lowered their eyes, because they knew exactly what he meant. Nathaniel continued, "And I got my answer." His voice remained calm, not angry, not emotional, just honest. The honesty somehow felt more powerful. "You showed me who you were." The statement wasn't directed only at Vanessa. It was directed at everyone. Every friend who vanished. Every partner who disappeared. Every person who abandoned him. Vanessa stood speechless. For the first time, she had no performance left. No charm. No manipulation. Only consequences. A few minutes later, security escorted her from the ballroom. Nobody objected. Nobody followed her. Nobody defended her. As the doors closed behind her, an unexpected feeling settled over the room. Relief. The lie was finally over. But Nathaniel wasn't finished. Not even close. Instead of returning to center stage, he walked toward the back of the ballroom, toward Grace. The plus-size maid immediately looked uncomfortable. As usual, she wanted to disappear. Attention had never felt natural to her. For years, people had looked at her and seen only two things: Her uniform. Her size. Nothing more. Nobody asked about her intelligence. Nobody asked about her character. Nobody cared enough to look deeper. Nathaniel stopped directly in front of her. The entire room watched. Grace. She looked up nervously. Yes? Nathaniel extended his hand. The gesture seemed small, yet somehow it felt enormous. Grace hesitated, then accepted. Together they walked toward the stage. Every eye followed them. Grace had never felt so exposed, or so terrified. Nathaniel faced the crowd, then spoke. The most important person in this room isn't a billionaire. Silence. It isn't a politician. More silence. It isn't a celebrity. Nathaniel turned toward Grace. It's her. Grace immediately shook her head, but Nathaniel continued. If Grace Holloway had stayed silent, none of this would have been uncovered. He paused. She protected my company. Another pause. My reputation. Another. And possibly my life. The room remained perfectly still. Nathaniel's voice softened. When everyone else abandoned me, he looked at Grace. She stayed. Tears formed in Grace's eyes. For years she had felt invisible. Tonight, for the first time, someone truly saw her. Not as a maid, not as a plus-size woman, as a person, as someone valuable. The applause started slowly. One person, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing, applauding, cheering, celebrating the woman they had ignored for years. Grace couldn't stop crying, not because she enjoyed the attention, because she never expected respect. And suddenly, she had all of it. Months later, life looked very different. Nathaniel's empire recovered completely. The fake bankruptcy ended. Business returned. Investors returned. Success returned. But Nathaniel had changed. This time, he was more careful about who he trusted. Some people attempted to reconnect. He declined. Some lessons only need to be learned once. Meanwhile, Grace's life changed too. Nathaniel offered her a senior position within the company. Not out of gratitude, out of respect. She had earned it. The same intelligence people overlooked for years was finally being recognized. The same woman people underestimated was now sitting at executive meetings. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Nathaniel. Over time, their friendship deepened. Then something else began growing. Slowly, naturally, without pressure, without games, without lies. For the first time in years, Nathaniel found himself trusting someone completely. One evening, they stood together on a terrace overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly before them. Grace smiled. "Do you ever regret the test?" Nathaniel thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the humiliation, the loneliness. Then he looked at her and smiled. "No." Grace laughed softly. "Why not?" Nathaniel took her hand. Because this time, there was no reason to hide how he felt. Because losing the wrong woman helped me find the right one. For a moment, neither spoke. The city glowed beneath them. The future waited ahead, and for the first time since this story began, the most feared mafia boss in New York wasn't thinking about power. He wasn't thinking about money. He wasn't thinking about reputation. He was thinking about the plus-size maid who had seen the truth when nobody else did. The woman everyone overlooked. The woman who saved his empire. And ultimately, the woman who saved his heart.